Pretty exciting. We've also heard today that this is not going to solve our problems in the long term. It takes a little bit of the pressure off, a little bit of the crisis, and it gives us a little bit of time as we implement all of the many things that we're working on, and including about the $1 billion that the state legislatures has invested in water conservation and water infrastructure over the next, as we're implementing all of that money in these programs.
Many of us in plant sciences, we teach plants need rain to grow. Now maybe we have to teach that growing plants makes rain fall. So
Cindy Morris, a microbiologist from France's National Agricultural Research Institute in Avignon. In this short presentation, I am going to talk about how some of the microorganisms that are commonly present on plants might have a role in rainfall that perhaps you had never heard about before. What are the factors that determine when, where, and how much it rains? First of all, the large-scale circulation patterns of the atmosphere create the conditions that make rainfall possible. Cloud condensation nuclei and giant cloud condensation nuclei catalyze the condensation of vapor to liquid cloud droplets. Ice nucleating particles catalyze freezing of cloud droplets to make drops that are heavy enough to fall as rain. Outer surfaces of leaves, for example, are naturally colonized by bacteria and fungi in the same way that our skin has a natural microflora. Healthy leaves can have 10,000 or more bacteria per gram of leaf. In fact, most of the known ice nucleation active microorganisms are found on plants, in leaf litter, or in soil. These different observations have led to the idea that ice nucleation active microorganisms are the key to a feedback cycle between land cover and the atmosphere. This feedback cycle has been called bioprecipitation. In this cycle, microorganisms are lifted into the atmosphere, they incite rainfall through their ice nucleation activity, and are deposited back to the ground with rainfall. There is accumulating empirical support for bioprecipitation. Upward flux of ice nucleation active bacteria has been measured. Ice nucleation active bacteria have been found in clouds in several independent studies. Ice nucleation active bacteria are in precipitation as it falls from clouds. The first strains of bacteria to fall with the onset of rain from a cloud are those able to catalyze freezing at the warmest temperatures. This is what you would expect if they were inciting the rain. This is a critical question because land use is changing at unprecedented rates, with crops now accounting for at least 50% of vegetated surfaces and over 90% of managed land cover. If we consider the amounts of bacterial aerosols that are emitted from different types of land covers, it is clear that tree culture and other crops are responsible for the vast majority of microbial aerosols. Therefore, the choice of plant species and agronomic or forestry practices could have an important influence on the microorganisms on these plants. Furthermore, the geographic location of these plants could be important to assure that their microorganisms are released into the atmosphere in strategic contexts that have an impact on rainfall. I'm going to show you in action, I hope this video works, the ice nucleation activity of the bacterium Pseudomonas syringae. So this is a tube of distilled water, sterilized distilled water in the lab, and we've cooled this water down to -7 degrees Celsius. So it's super cold. It's still liquid.
In the little pipette tip, the yellow tip, there's a suspension of this bacterium Pseudomonas ringi. And so now we're going to drop it into this super cold water. Okay, instantaneous. That water is super cold. That bacterium has the activity at that temperature. Bing, contact. And then once ice crystals start to form, it's a reaction, a chain reaction. The other molecules can't resist because then ice is catalyzing more ice. It's all under 0 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's what happens. We wanted to know if all geographical places were alike in this ability to be sensitive to the environmental input of land and aerosols, okay? And so we looked at the effect of different geographical regions and their sensitivities to aerosols. And we did this based on historical rainfall patterns. So we get this backward trajectory. So the top part of the graph, you see the path. The blue line is the line that arrives at the pin, at the destination in New Mexico, at 1,000 meters of altitude. And the red line is the line that arrives at 500 meters of altitude. That's the top graph. So you can see, I was really intrigued. It was a snowstorm that comes from Baja in Mexico. It scraped the ground and then uplifted. I suppose there's some mountains where it's getting to, it's kind of climbing up some mountains before it dumps. Okay, there's some force that lifts it up. So that's its altitude trajectory. So where does the water come from over continents? Plants. So, okay, a little bit from soil and a little bit from the lakes and streams, but over continents, where does the water in the atmosphere come from? Plants. We have completely transformed landscape, whereas we've eliminated wild land covers, and now 50% of land cover is agriculture, whereas that part, a big part of it was wild. So
how can we put this knowledge into practice to better manage our water resources?
Okay, that's the key question. So this was exactly what Denise asked me about this region here. And of the hundreds of people that participated, Denise asked the question, and I found it to be the most interesting question. So she said, we have cloud seeding in around the mountains here, and I'm not convinced that it's working. What should we do? So the first thing I did was, this is your mountain range, here, the North Edge mountain range. I looked at where the air masses were coming from. And so all these purple and green trajectories are the air masses arriving from the west.
Wondering, how big of an area do I suggest to the state of Utah that we could re-tree with native trees and plants, and they're drought resistant, and I've got all the resources from the forestry department, the reclamation nursery who grows them. They have an 80% success rate at planting these. All we need is the funding. How long and bring our water back? Because I would just do a strip that's as wide as your mountain is wide, right up to the mountains. Because what's going to happen, but of course you have to study the movement of your air masses, okay? What you would hope for is the formation of orographic clouds. Do you know what would colonize that side of the mountain, position it so it would be in the trajectory of those air masses, okay? And then if you have a physicist there, well, I don't know what you can measure. It'd be really nice to capture things in the atmosphere. So there's ways to measure ice nuclei in the atmosphere, but you could measure water vapor. There are ways apparently with cell phones to measure water vapor in the atmosphere. Send me a GPS point, and it didn't matter what time of year I looked at, the winds always are coming from the west. So that means that you have the air is being pushed up the mountains, and you have this phenomenon of orographic clouds. Many of you have seen clouds hanging on top of the mountains. And so what I suggested to her was that you could leverage these orographic clouds that form over the Mount Timpanogos. And that to do that, it would be ideal to revegetate this area here so that you would increase the atmospheric water vapor that was available for cloud formation, and that also you would increase the aerosols that could contribute to the rainfall.
evidence that revegetation or restoration of natural vegetation brings back the hydrological cycle. Has such regeneration been achieved?
Has it ever since the 1960s?
Dr. Goodall, may I ask you, Ethiopia planted about 500 million trees. Rwanda has done the same thing, and they've seen reversal of climate change problems. The hydrology cycle comes back to normal. Have you seen some of this personally?
Well, I've seen that all around in the countries where our youth program operates.
Yes.
The young people are planting trees, and they're planting hundreds in Burundi and in Tanzania.
You've seen the results, though.
I've seen the results.
It works, doesn't
even
it?
in our little programs.
Yes.
We have one water source where people used to go and drink water, and it totally dried out. And then trees were planted, and now the water's come back, and people are drinking from it.
Well, we're going to share that with the world. Thank you. I think
They put back the vegetation. It's always the same recipe. Put the vegetation on the top of the foothills. Then the water starts to come back. Then all these things that Denise observes heuristically and through her practices, a group of scientists convened in Belgium with Dave was among them and myself, and we compiled all of the literature that shows what vegetation can do for the planet. Because we're replanting forests mostly to sequester carbon, and that's one thing, but that's a small thing. And so what we demonstrated was that there is an effect on the precipitation recycling, humidity and rainfall triggers, which I just talked about. There's transport of atmospheric moisture. There's local and global scale heating and cooling. Okay, these are important. There's interception of fog and clouds. There's infiltration and helping the root systems will help the water get into the soil and into the water table. And of course, flood mitigation. When you don't have trees on slopes and you have heavy rains, you can have floods.
Are we at the crossroads now to make these decisions, or?
Oh, it has been for several years.
Then there's the notion of negative emissions. This is actually trying to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There are quite a number of strategies for this. Afforestation, so introducing forests into places that forests do not currently exist. Reforestation, and various means of soil carbon sequestration. Lots of these strategies involve changes to our agricultural system. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of these, and certainly this is where you can imagine much of your work being done in the world of mitigation. Geoengineering techniques that have been proposed, stratospheric aerosols, injecting stratospheric aerosols, sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere is one technique to cool the planet.
Can be used to be helpful, but ultimately not the answer. It's cultural. I would argue that Denise, what you worked on is very much cultural. This regenerative approach to agriculture and sustainable food systems, which are absolutely a piece of the equation, a big piece in taking us where we need to go.
Years in 2016, he presented the differences between reforestation and geoengineered weather, and he basically said that he loved this. And he just wrote me this the other day. Dear Denise, congratulations on the success you're having with your food forest. Temperature moderation and low water use, just wonderful. He's the one that gives me the data as well as a lot of meteorologists. With respect to Utah temperatures, Utah as a whole is warming at about twice the global average for the last 5 decades.
Today, I'm pleased to announce the United States will join 1 Trillion Trees Initiative.
Planting trees is nowhere near enough, and it cannot replace rewilding nature.
And the devastating loss of biodiversity are the greatest threats humanity has ever faced.
You end up with breaking the hydrological cycle.
Draw down atmospheric carbon, and one great natural technology to do that is in the form of trees and grasses.
This is not a drill.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate.
This is China's Lus Plateau. Until recently, this was one of the poorest regions in the country. A land renowned for floods, mudslides, and famine. My name is John D. Liu. I've been documenting the changes on the plateau for 15 years. Spoiled valleys in neighboring Sichuan show us how it might once have looked. How could a landscape with such potential have been reduced to this? The relentless grazing of domestic animals on the slopes meant that there was no chance for young trees and shrubs to grow. The rainfall no longer seeped into the earth, but simply walked down the hillsides, taking the soil with it. A local problem becomes a national problem. In the dry season, the light, unprotected soil is swept up in the winds, causing the dust storms that are blown over China's cities and beyond its borders. One thing that became apparent early on is the connection between damaged environments and human poverty. In many parts of the world, there's been a vicious cycle. Continuous use of the land has led to subsistence agriculture. And generation by generation, this has further degraded the soils.
The goal was to give a hat to the hilltops, give a belt to the hills, as well as shoes at the base. The hat meant that the top of these hills had to be replanted with trees.
Farmers were given financial compensation for not farming on them and keeping their livestock penned up. Resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land. The impact of such an enormous addition of vegetation goes far beyond the plateau itself. Ethiopia, perhaps more than any other country, has come to symbolize the vulnerability of humankind to environmental catastrophe. As on the Lus Plateau, centuries of subsistence farming practices have stripped the land of natural vegetation. The dry gullies bear the scars of flash floods. Without vegetation cover on the hillsides, when the rains come, the water doesn't soak into the ground but flows away in a flood. Then it's not available for agriculture during the rest of the year. This leads to drought, and famously for Ethiopia, famine. But just as I've witnessed in China, there is hope that the situation here can be reversed. In just 6 years, Professor Legessa Nagash and local villagers have transformed a severely eroded terrain by planting indigenous trees and plants. Almost miraculously, a clear flowing stream has emerged where once there was a muddy trickle.
How is it that it's possible for you to get the stream to flow throughout the year? It is because of the vegetation cover, which has been regenerating on this mountain. This water is maintained in the landscape because as soon as rain falls on the canopy on this vegetation, That rain then infiltrated gradually into the ground, ending up with this steady flow of this river.
Deforestation, especially for oil palm, to provide biofuel for Western countries, is what's causing these problems. And what you study. And the idea was that hill, 4 years later, there's this one green blob on the Earth's surface. And we have monitored every single one of those trees from space. It's only the vegetables in the trees, or directly the trees in the lines in that grass there, here. And this is after 2 years. And it's green. So we lowered the air temperature 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. The air humidity is up 10%. Cloud cover, I'm going to show it to you, is up, rainfall is up, and all these species and income. This eco lodge that I built there 3 years before was an empty yellow field.